This is taken from John chapter 10, verses 1 through 11. And this is Jesus speaking. Very truly, I tell you, Pharisees, anyone who does not enter the sheep pen by the gate, but climbs in by some other way, is a thief and robber. The one who enters by the gate is the shepherd of the sheep. The gatekeeper opens the gate for him, and the sheep listen to his voice. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. When he has brought out all his own, he goes on ahead of them, and his sheep follow him because they know his voice. But they will never follow a stranger. In fact, they will run away from him because they do not recognize a stranger's voice. Jesus used this figure of speech, but the Pharisees did not understand what he was telling them. Therefore, Jesus said again, very truly I tell you, I am the gate for the sheep. All who have come before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep have not listened to them. I am the gate. Whoever enters through me will be saved. They will come in and go out and find pasture. The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I have come that they may have life and have it to the full. I am the good shepherd, and the good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep.
Thank you, Dale. I'm glad Dale was up here because I'm going to use him as an illustration today, or a part of what I'm talking about. Sorry, I have to take my trick back here. He asked me today, he says, I read through this passage and I think it's a hard one to preach on perhaps because it says two seemingly different things. Number one, it says that Jesus is the gate. I am the gate. This is Jesus speaking. But it also says, I am the good shepherd. How do we reconcile the two things? And you know me, how nerdy I am. I'm getting all fidgety at this point when he's asking me. You know, like, oh, I can't wait to talk about that. So today I want to do something a little different. And you know that I'm going through the I Am series, that Jesus is telling us different attributes of himself through the book of John. And last week we talked about John chapter 6, where he talks about I am the bread of life. Talking about the manna falling from heaven, and while it's so tempting to worship the stuff coming down, if we miss that, if we miss the fact that it was the Creator who did that, we'll miss the point entirely. So I am the bread of life, sustainment, provision, all of those symbolic references that Jesus put in there, and he just goes through the book of John, and John wants to make sure he puts all of these together in chronology in his book, because they are so vital to our understanding of ourselves as Christians and who Jesus truly is. Okay? But I want to do something different today, in that I'm going to be preaching for a little bit. But towards the end of my message today, I have something I want to talk to you as a congregation about. And for that time, we normally video the whole message, and it's going to be a part of my message because I feel like it is a vital illustration of my point today, and I got the permission to talk about it. But then we're going to be turning off the camera for that time because of the private nature, and you'll understand here in just a little bit. So, what does it mean? John chapter 10 enters us into this mentality where the Pharisees were questioning who Jesus was once again. You know, Pharisees were this ultra fundamental, this is the way we've always done things, and this is the way we shall always do them, by God. You know. And they were ones that not only had the rules that they were living by, but they also had the rules that buffer those rules. So if God has told us to stay away from evil, then I'm going to choose all of the things that are evil, in my opinion, and build rules so that you can stay away from them. I know that was ancient thought process, and it doesn't leak into today. But the problem is, when Jesus came onto the scene, he was preaching heretical things like freedom for the captives. You know, grace and mercy. You know what's wrong with grace and mercy, if I'm a Pharisee today, is that if you start preaching grace and mercy, boy, it's Some people are going to misuse that, right? I have. I don't know if anyone else can raise their hand to that, but I know I have. I have not only thought that way, but I've also misused grace and mercy. So, the Pharisees are questioning who Jesus is at this very, very vital moment. And in those days, it was very common, that the Israelite people and the people who lived in Jerusalem around that time, very arid wilderness, all that kind of stuff. I want you to get this in your mind of what it looks like. Between cities, for us here in 2019, I didn't say 2018, I didn't slip. 2019, we have Fishers and Indianapolis and Noblesville, and they kind of all run together. Like, you might look up and see all of a sudden the sign you're entering a new city. But in those days, they were kind of all congregated together, and between cities there were just vast wildernesses that you would have to get to. So in those days, not only were the people highly nomadic, meaning they would travel from one place to the other, not really having a solid home, but they were agrarian. They had livestock and they had crops, as you can imagine. The ones that had livestock, had your typical livestock that you would think of: camels, donkeys, sheep, obviously, is what we're talking about here today. And there would be ways that they would get sheep from one place to the other so that they could use for trading, for eventual slaughter, for all of these different reasons economically why they were trying to transport the sheep, right? So they were going through the wilderness, and there was one, or actually a few designated people, depending on how big the herd of sheep were, and they were called shepherds. I know, nothing like groundbreakingly awesome yet, I understand that. But what happens when the trek is longer than the amount of light you have in the day? That the shepherds wouldn't just be walking with the sheep all day, all night, never take a rest. I mean, that's ridiculous, right? We wouldn't expect that. So their jobs, if they were to care for the sheep, raise the sheep, take them from one place to the other, perhaps big pastures, whatever the case may be, their job was to get the sheep from A to B as safely as possible. And sheep were, a part of the economy, so you got to maintain the amount of sheep you had. And this is also a little side note, this is also why we see the parable of the lost sheep. The shepherds in the crowd would have been sitting there going, yeah, I know what you're talking about. Like, you lose one sheep, whoever you're selling those sheep to are like, where are my 100? Like, yeah, I didn't buy 99 sheep, I bought 100. But the shepherd becomes family with these sheep, and he raises these sheep so much that any lost one, it's a big deal. Okay, so that's that kind of little side note about that parable. So the shepherd is entrusted, with the awesome responsibility of getting sheep from A to B. Now, every once in a while, going back to the whole lost sheep thing, every once in a while, what happens? A smaller, younger sheep wanders off. They may eat tufts of grass from time to time, but all they know is that at the end of their little feast, they're far from the 99, and they didn't intend that. So what does a shepherd do in that case? Well, he has to go out and go find that sheep, like we see in the parable, and he comes back. Well, what happens if that sheep constantly gets out from the group over and over and over again? Well, yeah, thank you, Michael. Yeah, as a lot of you already know this, but a shepherd would take this small sheep, it would break one of its legs. And while we think that's harsh, what happens is the shepherd would put that sheep around his neck or her neck and walk with that sheep until the leg is mended. What happens in that psychologically for the sheep, if we could sit down and analyze a sheep psychologically, would be the embedding of the personality and embedding of the trust from the sheep to the good shepherd, The shepherd, while inflicting a little bit of harm and pain on the sheep, is actually during this time drawing the sheep closer to him or herself. So it's strategic for the shepherd. Now, at the end of this time period, the sheep's leg is fine. You know, it can go on. It can go get sheared, wool, all that kind of stuff. Whatever the purpose of that particular sheep is going to be in the long run. It hurts. It doesn't feel good. And the sheep does not like it at the time. But that's what they do. They have to. There's a second thing that a shepherd does that directly relates to this passage today. Two things that are mentioned in this passage. Number one, that I am the gate. We're having shepherd talk here. And number two is I am the good shepherd. So he's kind of driving at home. On the outset, these two things seem entirely opposite or different entirely. Like one thing is this metal thing that opens, right? And it has the hinge on it, you got to put a little oil on it, and that's a gate, right? That's what we know as a gate. But what in those days, the gate for the shepherd and the shepherd were actually the exact same thing. And here's how I know that. When we get to city, these shepherds would have to protect these sheep. And in the middle of the night, when they have gone all they can go, they will build these temporary pens out in the middle, maybe back up against a mountain or whatever the case may be. These temporary pens out of wood and all this kind of things, but they would leave the front of these pens open. And so that they could eventually, at the end of the next morning, they could lead the sheep out. Well, how do you prevent sheep from going out? Or how do you prevent robbers, which was a huge thing, or predatory animals from coming in if there is no gate? Well, the shepherd would lay in front of that gap. They would set up camp. They would lay their bodies across the actual opening, so that any rustling of the sheep would wake him or her up, and any disturbance from the outside would cause them to jump to alarm. You know, we think of these sheep as these shepherds are these frail people that just have their hooks. You know what I'm saying? They wear the things, and what we imagine in the nativity scene, the shepherds, you know what I'm saying? We're all picturing it. And these little skinny boys. We see back in early Old Testament where David himself was a shepherd. And we're kind of surprised about, wow, he can fling rocks and kill lions. What's this all about? But really, that's not out of the realm of possibility, because shepherds were also trained to protect their sheep. The shepherd would lay down in front of the gap. The shepherd was the gate. So we see two things that are being represented here in this passage. Number one, we see that if you're called the good shepherd, there are two main things that are implied. First of all is guidance. We got to get from A to B. The shepherd knows the direction. The shepherd has been entrusted to the sheep, and the sheep have been entrusted to the shepherd. So there's guidance, there's direction, there's trust that has to be built. The second thing is protection. That the shepherd protects the sheep. These sheep are a valuable commodity. And one sheep alone, there are certain economic understandings of what one sheep would provide for a community, but one sheep alone, let's just be honest, there's not a whole lot of value in just one. Maybe for pet. But to have multiple sheep, the shepherd has to do some things that are uncomfortable for him or her to make sure that the sheep are safe. Sometimes it means there's a little bit of hurt that comes into play. Sometimes it means that that they have to stay up all night. that they have to put themselves in harm's way. But this shepherd is much more than just a person who is just hitting the sheep on the rear end to get them from one place to the other, although he or she does do that as well. This shepherd language that Jesus is using would have floored the Pharisees. What are you claiming? Because they weren't dumb. As hard-headed and stubborn as the Pharisees were, they were educated people. They understood parable, because they themselves all obviously taught in parable as well from time to time. So they understood metaphor, they understood all of that. So when Jesus is pointing out to people, saying, my sheep, and pointing to himself, saying shepherd, they're like, what are you saying? The Pharisees, or religious leaders of the time, would have automatically in their minds gone to the protection, that I'll do anything, fists up, got my staff. They go, oh, what is he going to do to us? Are you telling us that you're going to cause a revolt? Jesus was looking them right in the face and saying, I'm going to do anything to protect my sheep. That was some harsh language that Jesus was actually using in this mentality. And we know that in order for this relationship to be a good metaphor, we understand that the sheep out there are going to have to go through some things from time to time. And that's okay. As humans, we often, we want to put our hands up and say, Lord, if you truly love me, you won't let me go through any sort of pain. Why is there pain in the world? Well, I don't know if we need to bring up the past, but we kind of brought it. And if we would have stayed away from that fruit on the tree, you remember when we were there? But we raise our hands and say, Lord, why are you making me go through this? And at the time, as a pastor, I can sit there and say, well, the Lord is taking you through this to teach you a lesson. And every single one of you are going to go, wow, Pastor Landon, thank you. I feel so much better. Right? Of course, because we're all mature, we've been through it, and we can stand up and say, well, then in that case, let's barrel forward. Praise God.
Bring it on.
Bring it on. No, 100% of us will not do that. And I might even be low on that projection. Each time God takes us through something utterly difficult and seemingly damaging and destructive in our own lives, it hurts Him just as much as it hurts us, if not more. Because while we as the sheep are limping around because the shepherd broke our leg, He's also carrying us around His neck, teaching us what trust really looks like. I am the good shepherd. Do you think it's weird that He added the word good there? Because He's not going to break our leg unless it's for a reason. If we wouldn't have wandered off, never mind, I'm not going to go there. I'm the good shepherd. So everything that He does is filtered through that word good. But there is nothing for our harm or malicious, not malicious. Jeremiah 29:11, and this is kind of a side note here, not exactly in the 100% context, and I can get into that some other time, but listen to me when I say it, it's very much related. Jeremiah 29:11 tells us that He wishes the best for us. He knows the plan He has for us, declares Him. plans not to harm us, but to prosper us. Plans to just set us right there and help us to do exactly what we've always said. No, 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 no. Plans to give us a hope and a future. It means that there is a destination, A to B. The shepherd is getting us there. We just have to trust him. Okay. So we know what a shepherd is. And I want to read this really quick. This is a little excerpt that that Dale already read for us. I'm going to start at verse 7 of what he read before. Therefore Jesus said, "Again, I tell you the truth, and I am the gate for the sheep. All who ever came before me were thieves and robbers, but the sheep did not listen to them. I am the gate. Whoever enters through me will be saved. He will come in and go out and find pasture." And this is the part I want you to hear. The reason the shepherd lays in front of the gate, sacrifices his or her life for the benefit of the sheep is this: the thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. But I have come that they may have life and have it to the full. Different meaning now. I laid my life down so that these sheep can get to where they need to go. So here's the different part. And I won't continue through the months, but I'm going to ask that we turn off the camera at this point